Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the OCC's continuing series of webinars during the COVID-19 crisis. I'm Rocco Rossi. I have the great honor of being the president and CEO of the OCC. And right off the top, I just want to wish you and all of yours the best of health in these difficult circumstances, and to remind you that we at the OCC are here to help in whatever way we can. A big shout out to our supporting sponsors of the webinar series, Canada Life and Chambers Plan. Thank you for making this possible. I want to get it over to the panel as quickly as possible because we brought together a phenomenal group, and would start it with just one thought from former President Bill Clinton, who famously said, "There's nothing wrong with the US-Canada relationship that can't be solved with all that is right with the Canada-US relationship." And certainly this crisis is putting all of that to a test. So we're delighted to have such a great panel, and I want to hand it over to my friend and great partner of the OCC, Mark Fisher, the founder and CEO of the Council of the Great Lakes region, that puts on a fantastic annual summit of this incredible region, which, if it were examined just on its own, would represent the third largest economy in the world. So these issues are critical. Over to you, Mark, to introduce the panels and get us going.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Rocco. I've certainly really been pleased with the webinars that the OCC has been putting together. I think they're both very timely and really important for understanding not only how Ontario is moving through the pandemic response and recovery, but I think having important conversations like this about the region and how Ontario is connected across the border to the 8 Great Lakes states and beyond. And I think just to set some context before we introduce the panel for this conversation, as Rocco was saying, if you put Ontario and Quebec together with the 8 Great Lakes states, this region would represent roughly a $6 trillion economy. That would make it the third largest economy in the world behind the United States and China. So it's a massive economy. It is by far the most important economy to both Canada and the United States, if not North America. And I think when you look at that level of economic activity and the trade that happens within this region, it just couldn't happen without the multimodal transportation network that we have here. It includes upwards of 32,000 kilometers of highways, roughly 80,000 kilometers of rail lines, and close to 70 modal terminals. We have 15 large international marine ports and 50 regional marine ports in the region. And because we have Air Canada participating in our webinar, we've also got 12 of the top 50 North American airports in the Great Lakes region. So this is the transportation network that really makes this region move forward. And so what we wanted to do here today is just talk about some of those cross-border dynamics, both in terms of that interconnectivity of the transportation network, but more importantly, the trade that's happening right now and the movement of people across that border and how it's affecting everybody differently. Again, whether it's Air Canada or local communities like Windsor, Detroit, or even between the two federal governments. So with that, why don't we get to our discussion? And it's my pleasure to start with Tejal Shah, who everybody knows for her great work at the U.S. Consulate. She's the Chief of Political and Economic Affairs. And I'd like to turn it over to Tejal to say a few words. And then once we get through the other panelists, we're going to open it up for a bit of a Q&A. And you also have an opportunity through the chat function to provide some of your comments and questions as well. So Tejal, over to you. Just have to make sure that we put your mute off.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction, and thank you to the Ontario Chamber of Commerce for inviting the consulate to join today's discussion. I think both Mark and Rocco set the stage that this is an important set of discussions we should be having on the important cross-border relationship. And we are, without a doubt, living in some extraordinary and unprecedented times today, where our governments and our people are at the foremost focused on the health and safety of our citizens to fight COVID-19. And with that, on behalf of the consulate and our community, we certainly hope you and your loved ones are keeping safe and healthy. Please also let me take a moment at the top today to express our deepest condolences for the family and friends of all the victims from the tragic events in Nova Scotia. We are simply heartbroken. I had an opportunity to visit Nova Scotia for a work trip last December, and I remember very fondly the kindness and the warmth and the close-knit community that's there in the province. We have a close working relationship with the RCMP across Canada, and the United States is prepared to extend our investigative assistance. And also closer to home here in Ontario for our community, please also accept our condolences for the 2-year anniversary of the tragic van attack on Yonge Street as well. Turning to today's discussion, I wanted to focus on the importance of the US-Canada relationship. We share a deep and strong ties with our northern neighbor. We have a strong focus right now, obviously, on fighting the pandemic, but that's not to say that the important work with respect to the North American trade relationship, the supply chains, and the interconnectedness of our markets doesn't continue. And we have seen, throughout the pandemic response in the last several weeks, a true commitment by people on both sides of the United States and Canada, working with tremendous dedication and lots of generosity very closely together. This is happening on many levels, from an individual level between Canadians and Americans, and across multiple levels, from municipal ties to state provincial ties to federal ties across both governments. I think, as I said at the beginning, the highest emergency focus right now is on getting our citizens home safely, ensuring that the cross-border flow of essential workers continues, and ensuring that medical supplies are reaching the communities that are of greatest need. Much of this coordination, as you might know, is happening between our governments at various offices, taking place at our embassies in Washington and Ottawa, but is also supported through a number of efforts across Canada and across the United States, including at the consulate in Toronto. And throughout the response, we've seen any number of inspiring and untold stories of the tremendous cross-border collaboration in our local communities, businesses, neighbors, and even strangers. We are immensely grateful to the thousands of healthcare professionals crossing the border every day to provide life-saving medical care. Our team at the consulate has been in touch with key border communities spanning Windsor, Niagara, and Sault Ste. Marie. Consul General Stanford spoke with the mayors in these communities and thanked them for the immense support that they're providing to Americans. Neighbors help neighbors. All of us at the US Mission in Canada are extremely grateful for the other essential workers as well, particularly truck drivers and agricultural workers who cross the border daily, as well as the Canadian and American customs and border colleagues who facilitate essential trade that continues between our countries. And as this audience knows particularly well, our businesses are leveraging resources and innovation to fight this pandemic. We're witnessing truly pioneering examples of how manufacturing and research firms are working to mobilize against the virus. So as you can see, leaders in capitals, in major cities, in public health, custom and border officials, we're all grappling with the unprecedented challenges of this epidemic. These times are very dynamic, they're fast moving, circumstances are changing, and so it is natural at times that there might be some confusing moments, some challenges that have had to be worked out between our two countries, with the goal of ensuring that critical equipment is reaching communities on both sides that need it the most. I can assure you that the US government is working across multiple levels closely with our Canadian friends to address these challenges as they arise. As Secretary Pompeo told Foreign Minister Champagne a few weeks ago, the United States will work with Canada to ensure the viability of the international supply chains for crucial supplies, while we also meet the needs of communities on both sides of the border with the most severe outbreaks. This past Monday, in close collaboration, the United States, Mexico, and Canada agreed to extend restrictions on non-essential travel across our shared border for 30 additional days. And we continue to work with both Canada and Mexico to protect our citizens while continuing to minimize the adverse economic impacts. Our border agencies, CBP and CBSA, they remain open for business at the ports, and they're very focused on facilitating trade and commercial activity. These are exempt from non-essential land border travel restrictions. The general feedback that we're getting across the mission in Canada and for our colleagues in Washington is that from companies, cargo is moving well and without incident in both directions. A significant example in these extraordinary times that our colleagues at CBP highlighted, from the Detroit field office, they've processed over 100,000 commercial trucks entering Michigan from the Canadian side since the travel restrictions went into effect on March 21st. As the CBP Director of Field Operations in Detroit noted, approximately 35% of all travel between Canada and the United States flows through Michigan, and with Port Huron being the fourth busiest and Detroit being the second busiest commercial trade crossing in the United States. CBP has also processed more than 150 commercial shipments of COVID-19 related supplies through the Detroit, Port Huron, and Sault Ste. Marie crossings, as well as the Detroit Metro Airport since the start of the pandemic. Our border officials recognize the importance of global supply chains for economic security. They continue to facilitate food, fuel, workers, and life-saving cargo transiting our borders 24/7. Our commercial colleagues with offices here in Toronto, throughout Canada, and across the United States have not only not had any complaints about trade flows, that's a great sign. What we've received the most number of questions and inquiries about from US companies is to better understand what is essential travel and what is not in Canada, including what the different province-wide specific requirements are. And really, that's the kind of questions that we've been seeing. There hasn't been an impediment to the flow of goods and cargo across the border. Let me also add here that CBP has opened up a direct email communication link to assist companies engaged in cross-border facilitation of COVID-19 related medical items to ensure that goods can flow across the border swiftly and without incident. Turning also to the broader relationship and the trade relationship, I also want to highlight that we were very pleased on April 2nd to receive Canada's official notification of USMCA ratification. This is an important step towards implementing this state-of-the-art modern agreement. We're continuing to work with Canada and Mexico to determine an entry into force date. Work continues to take place at technical levels on next steps and implementation. This modern agreement will not only strengthen and deepen the North American economy. I think what we're seeing is that the pandemic crisis has served as a further reminder of just how important the North American supply chains are and how we need to continue to strengthen them. Moreover, recognizing the important role that our closest neighbors play in the national defense interest and the integration of our economies and supply chain, we also understand that negative impacts to key workers, including a lack of personal protective equipment, has had an impact in critical sectors in Canada and in Mexico. Now, there have been some reports of interruptions to supply chains, but again, there has also been some confusion in this great time of things moving swiftly. And so what I want to highlight today, and something that our Charge d'Affaires and Acting Ambassador in Ottawa will be highlighting further this afternoon, is on April 21st, the Federal Emergency Management Agency announced exemptions from an April 10th FEMA rule regarding prioritization and allocation of certain scarce health and medical resources to fight COVID-19. Among the 10 exemptions for shipments, this includes Canada and Mexico. So just to be very clear, there is now an exemption as of April 21st in place for shipments of certain PPE type of equipment that's outlined in the FEMA registry for Canada and Mexico. There are many critical sectors such as food and agriculture, communications, energy, automotive and industrial, water, wastewater management, law enforcement, and first responders that cross our national boundaries regularly. The administration also recognizes that an infectious disease threat anywhere is a threat everywhere, and we must all unite to fight this critical global health security challenge while continuing to ensure we respond to the immediate response in our countries. The US government is delivering a comprehensive package of services to support our international partners to combat COVID-19 through our SAFER package, building on current, substantial, and long-standing US government global health and humanitarian assistance of over $170 billion abroad over some 20 years. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join today's discussion. I look forward to your questions. And on behalf of the Consul General and our team across agencies here in Toronto and broader Canada, please know that we're here to be helpful with your queries. Should you need contacts or information, we are here to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Tejal. That's very helpful and very informative. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Rakesh Naidu, who is the President and CEO of the Windsor-Essex Regional Chamber of Commerce, both a friend of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, but also the Council of the Great Lakes Region. Rakesh, it's great to have you today. Over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning to everyone. I want to start off by thanking OCC for inviting me to this panel. Rocco, you're doing a fabulous job. Thanks for your leadership and for all the great effort that OCC and the entire Chamber Network is putting in trying to help the companies navigate through this very difficult times. Mark, pleasure to see you. You've been a great leader at Council for Great Lakes Region. I've had the fortune of being at the board with you, and I've seen you from close quarters in terms of what you do, the tremendous amount of effort you put in, and the influence that you have on several issues, but most definitely on cross-border issues. And Tejal, it's wonderful to see you again. You're no stranger to Windsor-Essex region. You've been here a few times, and I've had the pleasure of working with you on many issues, including how do we manage, the not so recent issue of aluminum and steel tariff, which impacted this region, but also other regions in Canada. Tejal provided a lot of context and information on cross-border issues and how the two countries are very tightly integrated. I just want to highlight a little bit more in terms of the trade that happens between the two countries, and specifically what happens between Ontario and US. On a daily basis, just in terms of the number of people that cross the border, there's close to about 500,000 people that are crossing the border every month. There's about $2.7 billion of goods that crosses the border on a daily basis. Just think of that number, 2.7 billion on a daily basis. So Canada is the largest destination for US exports, and many of us know here that there are about 35 states in US that have Canada as their largest trading partner. So just reinforcing the importance of trade between Canada and US. Of the total trade that happens between Canada and US, Ontario takes about 50% of the exports from US. Almost 80% of Ontario's exports go to United States. And if you were to look at the second largest country to which Ontario export, it is UK. The number or the times that Ontario exports products to US as compared to UK is 10 times. So you can imagine the volume of trade that happens not just with Canada and US, but specifically Ontario as well. Now, 87% of Ontario's merchandise, this is which is exported to US, consists of manufactured goods. So there is other commodities also, but manufactured goods is 87%, a huge chunk of what we export. And of that, 35% is automotive. Just drives home the importance of supporting automotive as a sector. And as you all know, Windsor-Essex region, the southwestern Ontario, all the way from here to Oshawa region is a very important belt for the auto industry production and supply chain. So 35% is of the total export that Ontario has to US consists of automotive parts. And if you were to just look at the imports and exports of Ontario, it consists of roughly about 30% each. So if you were to think of Ontario, if it were a country by itself, it would be one of the most trade intensive countries in the world. And if you were to take into account what that same volume of import and exports for Canada as compared to Ontario, the import and export volume roughly is about 25%. So you can see that Ontario is much higher when it comes to the percentage of imports and exports. So very trade intensive, as I mentioned. Now let's look at the total amount of goods that are transported, and the modes of transportation. So the four modes of transportation, we've got road, rail, marine, and air. Of all of these, 74% of the total goods that is transported via road, so on trucks. That's a significant amount. And of that, if you were to just look into the Ontario, where the goods are being shipped and where it is crossing into US or from US into Canada, there are four major crossings. Of course, the Detroit Windsor crossing, the Blue Water Bridge, the Peace Bridge, and the Lewiston Queenston Bridge. These are the four bridges which handles most of the goods that is traded between the two countries. To the extent that almost 90% of Ontario's truck trade happens, within this four bridges I mentioned, and almost 60% of Ontario's total trade with the United States. So these four crossings and this four bridge play an extremely important part when it comes to trade with the US. So of that, Windsor-Essex region, which is a border region, as you know, the bridge that we have, the Ambassador Bridge, and this crossing that we have, which is one of the busiest crossing in North America, it handles almost $500 million worth of goods on a daily basis, which is almost 1/3 of the total trade between the two countries, truck-based trade, by road. On a daily basis, we see approximately about 11,000 trucks, not at this time. Pre-COVID, almost 11,000 trucks and almost 17,000 passenger cars. Because of where we are and how tightly integrated the two economies are, especially the Windsor-Essex region, the greater Detroit region, we see a lot of integration, not just in manufacturing, but otherwise as well. In terms of people crossing, there's roughly about 7,000 people that cross the border every day. Of that, there's roughly about 1,500 to 2,000 healthcare workers. So even today, there are several healthcare workers that cross into the Detroit region and offering their support and services to hospitals in the Detroit region. Almost 800 people from Detroit region cross into the Windsor-Essex region and the other places on a daily basis. And just to give an example of how busy this border crossing is, if I were to just take an example of one major employer, Fiat Chrysler, which is a major employer here, one of the largest employer that assembles, the Dodge Caravan and the Chrysler Pacifica here. If you were to just take that operation into account, they have about 1,300 component shipments in a day. About 2,000 cars is what they used to ship, and about 1,600 custom entries just by one organization. And now, if you add to that, the various supply chain partners and several tier 1s and tier 2s and tier 3s that we have here, you can understand that this is, a very busy border crossing. And also, when it comes to, import and export from this region, it's because of, the integration, especially in the auto industry, in the manufacturing industry. We have a lot of manufacturing companies that are export oriented. We have close to about 1,000 manufacturing companies. Of that, 90%, so 900, are exporting. And of that, 80% of them are exporting into the US regions, US destinations. Even when it comes to agribusiness and food processing, almost 70% of what we grow is exported into the US regions. And we have one of the largest greenhouse industry here, so we grow a lot of different produce, and most of that finds its final destination into US regions. So because of manufacturing, the trade, the transportation, we have a very active and a very thriving logistics and transportation sector here, which consists of about 2,600 businesses, and that employs about roughly 10,000 people just in the Windsor-Essex region. And we also have a lot of truck drivers that consider Windsor-Essex as home. About 3,700 truck drivers reside in Windsor-Essex. And we've seen that in the last 1 year, there have been about 380 plus trucking companies that have started operation in the Windsor-Essex area. And that's got to do with, in 2019, in US, the electronic logging system became mandatory, and that required, or that facilitated a lot of trucking operators, to come closer to the border, to take advantage of the opportunities that ELS provided. With that, we have a number of owner operators that now have made Windsor-Essex their home. So, this sector, logistics, transportation, is a very thriving sector, which not only benefits the Windsor-Essex region, but the whole belt from here to Oshawa, southern Ontario and southwestern Ontario. Very, very thriving region when it comes to manufacturing, and relies heavily on the logistics and transportation sector, which also is very well represented. And also we have two very well-known organizations here that support, border traffic, border transportation, and cross-border trade, which we have the Cross-Border Institute at the University of Windsor and the Institute for Border Logistics and Security. Two very well-known organizations do fantastic work. And for those of you who are interested in learning more about the border issues, if you need some assistance with research, if you need help in terms of education and other information related to the border, you may want to reach out to these two organizations. IBLS specifically has been very active in terms of identifying how the border can be automated, how the new border crossing, the Gordie Howe Bridge, which is under construction, how that can be enabled so that autonomous vehicle crossings can be enabled. They have a fantastic infrastructure, the virtual cave, which is the largest in Canada, and it's something which private sector companies can take advantage of. So I wanted to give you this picture on the importance and the significance of trade and transportation for not just this region, throughout Ontario and Canada. So extremely vital for us to keep the border open, and there has been concern in the past in terms of whether this will whether this border will be closed, or whether it will be restricted. And thankfully we are seeing that all essential items, there is no restriction. The border remains open for that. Though we are seeing a reduction in the volume of trade that is happening, the border remains open and functional. In terms of what is happening currently, which affects trade and transportation, we've seen that there has been a drop in commercial traffic. The daily traffic on the Huron Church Road, which connects to the Ambassador Bridge, we're seeing a decline of about over 50% in terms of daily traffic. And when it comes to commercial traffic, trucks, we're seeing the traffic down by over 40%. So though essential commodities and products are being freely traded, the manufacturing industry and the other industry which is vital for this region, many of them have either slowed down or shut down, and that has resulted in a reduction in volume of truck traffic. Our tunnel, which is the Detroit tunnel, is seen significant drop, almost over 80% drop in traffic as compared to the same time last year. And we've had a Detroit truck ferry, Detroit-Windsor truck ferry, which has been closed for the first time in the last 30 years. So clearly, cross-border traffic, cross-border trade has been impacted by COVID-19. We're also seeing some challenges when it comes to truckers and companies who are bringing products in from US. We've seen that some of the drivers were challenged because of the need for them to self-isolate and not being able to go into the communities that they live in and carry out their normal activities. That's been a challenge that has been mentioned by several trucking companies and drivers. And of course, there is challenges in terms of getting healthcare workers to provide their services on both sides, concerns related to health and so on, which has been recently addressed. And as of today, there are several healthcare workers that continue to offer the services in Detroit. Some of the healthcare workers were asked, or pretty much everyone was asked to choose between, offering the services in the Windsor Essex area or in Detroit. Some have chosen to work in the Windsor Essex area, and some continue to offer the services in the Detroit area. So in closing, I just wanted to underline the importance of this region, of the various border crossing that we have, and the important role they play in ensuring that trade continues even at this time between the two countries. The volume of trade that crosses, especially those 4 bridges that I mentioned, which is over 90% of Ontario's truck trade, is vital to ensure that not only at this time we keep the companies that are making the essential items like this hand sanitizers, the PPEs, and so on, and also delivering food and the other items that are very much needed. These borders are playing a key role in making sure that we continue to have some resemblance of normal life, where we are able to get the essential items and the grocery stores are stocked. Going forward, it will become even more important that these borders are open and the borders work efficiently and the cost of border crossing is minimized, so that we can get back the various sectors that rely on cross-border trade back on their feet at the earliest, where we minimize their cost and where we help in ensuring that the supply chain disruption, which has happened today, is minimized. And the border can play a huge role in this. The cross-border trade that happens, where the two regions, the two countries, and the companies that are in those regions need the borders to remain open, need the trade to flow freely, and that this is the way in which we can continue to bring ourselves back slowly to opening up the economy. There will be trade disruptions going forward. It won't be like switching, flipping a switch and turning everything back to normal. It will take some time to really bring the economy back on its track. But I think with the mechanism that we have, the strong cross-border trade that we have, the companies on both sides, and the border infrastructure we have, it gives me great hope that we'll be able to, to do really well in bringing our economies of both countries back on track soon. So with that, I will pause here, and I look forward to taking any questions later on. I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
That's great. Thanks, Rakesh. And I think on behalf of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and the Council of the Great Lakes Region, we want to thank you for the great work that you're doing. I think the Canada-US relationship is very fortunate to have leaders like yourself on the front lines of the border. And so thank you for everything that you do on a day-to-day basis. And in between the presentations, I've looked at our attendees list, and I just want to call out one specific individual who I know is on the line, Earl Provo, who is our new Ontario representative for most of the Midwest Great Lakes states. Welcome, Earl, to the webinar, and hope you're getting a lot of knowledge and facts that you can use in your day-to-day work. With that, it's now my pleasure to turn it over to our next and last speaker, John Tory, who I know a lot of you know. John is the Director of Business Development at Air Canada, and is really here to provide a unique perspective, I think, in terms of cross-border transportation, not only the movement of people, but also the movement of goods across the border between our two countries, but also around the world. So John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Ontario Chamber and all of the attendees for listening to all of us today, and for welcoming myself on behalf of Air Canada, and also proudly as a board member of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce to speak to you today and share a few thoughts. I'll try to keep it brief. One of the advantages to going last is that I don't need to repeat all of the excellent and very, very well thought out notions and comments that have been expressed by my colleagues before me on the panel, but did want to echo the importance, certainly, that we're seeing of relationships between chambers of commerce, between governments of all levels, and between individuals in the corporate community, and in those who extend to beyond those direct relationships in our corporate community, to those who help support people who are working in the corporate community, to those who are out as first responders who we don't always see necessarily as part of the corporate community, but who are definitely there for us, and who are making it possible so that many of us can continue to try to operate in a semblance of normalcy, and to a rosier, brighter days which are ahead of us. I think that it goes without saying that those of us in the airline business are finding these times very challenging, and that, as much as we are trying to stay focused on what's happening in the future, a lot of what we're doing is built around ensuring that our operations are there for our customers and for our countries today. At Air Canada, my typical role is to serve as the Director of Business Development. So what that means day to day is myself and my team go out and we try to find new customers, and we try to find people who are doing business with Air Canada but maybe have not organized that business, or we're trying to find people who have not done a lot of business or are not doing a great percentage of their business with Air Canada and can do more, or people who, it's pretty rare to find somebody who hasn't heard of Air Canada, but they do exist, as people who come from other countries and who are gratefully coming to Canada and setting up and investing here, and we want Canada to be an important part of their travel experience. With all these recent changes, myself and my team, as was alluded to in the introduction, have also started turning our eye towards making sure that the corporate community and the international community is aware of our capabilities when it comes to cargo. A lot of news is being made about Canadian carriers like Air Canada, and we're proud to be part of that equation, going to places like China and South America and Europe, and making sure that the supply chain for goods like PPE and pharmaceuticals remains intact and functional. But also please know that a lot of our work is based around moving essential goods that you might consider essential to your business and that may not be as broadly viewed as essential by the media, but we are there for you. And so if the little sales pitch I do on these things is to say, please, if you think that us or any Canadian carrier can help you, please do consider Air as a bridge in your supply chain during these unusual times. I will just briefly say that the importance of the Great Lakes region, of the US-Canada relationship, and just of the overall flow of goods, information, people, and money cannot be overstated. It is so essential to what we do. We don't publicly disclose the percentage of our revenue that comes from the United States, but it is one of our largest markets in terms of taken as a single entity. The United States transborder traffic is a critical market for Air Canada. And as I'm sure you saw this week, we've had to suspend passenger services to those markets. We can't wait to get back into the game, to supporting all of these regions and to making sure that we are there for people who want to travel to and from Canada, the United States, and abroad and around the world with Air Canada. I have a lot of comments to make about safety and what we're doing and the various modes of transport, although it was quite well communicated prior to that. Surface is operating at a very, very high efficiency with a strong attention paid to worker safety and to road safety. I think that one of the only things I'll add to that is to say that a lot of the attitudes about safety and employee protection extend to the air as well, with recent announcements certainly that were geared towards passenger protection, but also employee protection about how people are to conduct themselves and to be dressed on board flights. And to say that please, one of the few things that I hope remains out of this horrible disease situation is I hope that our compassion and our ability to understand the struggles people are going through remains as we come out of this. And I hope that as a corporation, as well as just as a person, I hope that we are able to remember empathy and stress and things that affected people as we all had the situation well beyond most of our control. But I also would encourage everybody to remember that safety when it comes to transportation doesn't just mean PPE and desanitizing and wearing a mask. It also means things like hours of service and the appropriate training to handle, operate, and monitor and inspect your equipment, and the ability to use the infrastructure around your equipment, which also means that people who are working on the surface in intermodal exchange at terminals, airports, flight crew, truck drivers, and everybody involved in supporting that is also appropriately trained and appropriately rested. We're seeing a lot of pressure in various modes to see service hour extensions. For example, I know on the surface it's been a big point of discussion to see service hour extensions. Let's just please remember that a lot of those limitations are carefully considered. And while it's critical that we get PPE and other goods like that to our door, we certainly from a risk standpoint don't want to be adding to the injury or other physical stress points just in order to make, say, a 12-hour deadline appear a little bit tighter. With that, Mark, I'll say thank you for the ability to make an introduction. Air Canada is always proud to, as we say, fly the flag and to be here and talk about ourselves and to help our corporate and business community partners to find their way through difficult times.
That's great, John, and thank you for that great presentation. I think it's fair to say that Air Canada is Canada's brand in the sky, and we certainly enjoy traveling with Air Canada across the Great Lakes and into the United States, and thank you for that fantastic update. So right now we're going to go to a lightning round of questions because we've got about 15 minutes left, and we've got an individual question for each of the panelists, and I'm going to go back and start with Tejal. I think based on your update, you covered a lot of ground. And I guess the one question that I have as the region, as Ontario starts to think about the recovery from the pandemic, you mentioned the USMCA and coming into force. You know, how much of an enabler do you think that the agreement will be once it's in place to that economic recovery, and particularly, you know, trying to encourage trade and travel across the border when it's the right time to do that?
Thank you, Mark. I think that's an important point and overall question. I mean, certainly we've seen for some time now the benefits that NAFTA has yielded our economies and all of North America, with 3 countries included. And it's clear that USMCA will further deepen those connections. I think we have amongst the world's most integrated market, if I can say so, with the North American economies. And I think with USMCA and now the ratification by all 3 countries, that will further just hit home that point. And we're already seeing and we're witnessing in these unprecedented times the importance of the North American supply chain and how we can continue to strengthen them. And so I think that this modern trade agreement will do just that. And if I might, let me elaborate specifically on Chapter 5 of the trade agreement, the digital trade chapter. I think we're seeing the importance of that right now in real time, sort of the way our economies and our consumers are ordering much needed supplies, how families are staying home and increasingly getting goods online. Companies are 3D printing goods, as well as important medical equipment, to other types of innovations that we're seeing. And also we're seeing healthcare workers, from doctors and nurses, who are able to leverage the power of telemedicine. So it goes without saying that the digital trade chapter is quite fitting for the way in which I think our economies are positioning themselves in what is clearly a fourth industrial revolution. And at the consulate in particular, we have worked under the Consul General's leadership on an innovation partnership to further strengthen and build on those ties, taking advantage of the forthcoming digital trade chapter and the trade agreement. And I think overall, you'll see that with the digital trade chapter, it will protect digital trade from harmful duties and localization programs that you find in many countries outside of the North American region. With respect to the automotive sector, we will also see that it's going to be bringing more jobs as a whole to North America. With respect to de minimis shipments, we'll see that with USMCA, there's going to be an increased ability for mom and pop shops, for SMEs to be able to send goods across the border without paying any duties. And as supply chains are stretched, it's going to help small businesses get their goods to their customers. So without a doubt, the USMCA is going to bring great dividends for our economies.
That's great. Thanks, Tejal. Rakesh, next to you. So, you know, in your presentation, I think it's clear that the cities of Windsor and Detroit really do operate as one community, and they're both a barometer of how well both countries are doing with respect to border management and how we're securing the easy movement of trade and travel across the border. You highlighted a number of things that are going on currently in terms of the pandemic. Are there any recommendations that you would like to provide in terms of what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, what we could be doing better? You know, I guess hopefully in the last stages of the pandemic, but more importantly, as we start to think about that recovery, what should governments be thinking about in terms of how do we enable and support and energize our cross-border communities in order to get back to business?
Thanks for that, Mark. You rightly pointed out, you know, there's a very strong integration of the economies with Windsor Essex especially, and in the Detroit region and the other border communities that we have. We've seen even in the past, you know, a great deal of interaction amongst companies and you know, products that are jointly built, which is something which is very unique to North America. Many of us know here that, you know, when a car is finally assembled in any of the assembly shops, whether it's in Windsor Essex area in Canada, anywhere else in Canada, or in US, it has the key parts has crossed between the two borders at least 6 to 7 times before it gets finally assembled in one of the final assembly shops. So it just goes to show you the importance of the tightly integrated economy and the supply chain that we have here. The supply chain has, you know, several pressures that has been put on it currently. As you know, there is reduction in terms of volume. There's also the cost, which, you know, one has to pay in just, you know, even during normal times, just crossing the border, and that adds to the overall cost of trade. On an average, we've seen that the cost of crossing the border, you know, if you were to make parts in the Windsor Essex area or anywhere else in Canada and then transport it over the border to US, the total cost approximately, just because of, you know, whether it is the border delays, whether it is because of cost of compliance, or whether it's because currently we have, you know, we have to bring in the empty trucks back from US, and even, you know, US trucks have to go empty from Canada into US. So all of these, you know, whether it's the delays at the border because of the various procedures, the security checks that needs to be done, and the cost of compliance, that adds almost about 0.5 to 1% to the overall cost of that particular shipment by value, you know, of the product that is being shipped. As we go forward, these cost is going to become more and more onerous for companies to handle and to be able to absorb. As we slowly bring our economies back, the companies will be challenged in terms of how do they really ensure that they're producing the product in the quantity that is needed, ensuring that the supply chain works properly, that they are part of the integrated supply chain, which relies very much on the border because of just-in-time requirements, and how they can keep the cost less. So one of the suggestions that we have is how do we really ensure that the cost of transactions over the border is reduced? And by looking at various means to do that, whether it is using new tools and technology, to ensure that the processing of documents, processing of information happens before the shipment arrives at the border. Currently, there are several technologies that are being used: RFID, VoIP, gamma ray scanning, and so on. Can we really enhance this so that there can be as much automation as is possible at the border, so that the cost can go down? There is a good example recently of the tunnel crossing that we have here, where they've used Nexus eGate, where what they're doing is they're using RFID, CCTV, and VoIP protocols to ensure or to enable that enable a CBP or a CDSA person to actually interact with and remotely process goods and people by still staying inside their office and not really being on the booth on the primary inspection lane. So these measures or these intervention using technology can help in reducing the cost of border crossing. And I think that is something which we really feel needs to happen, or is there is a need for us to, one, increase the flow of traffic, reduce the delay at the border, and reduce the overall cost of border shipment. And this has become vital.
That's great. Thanks, Rakesh. Now, John, the last word. So Air Canada, I was looking at the numbers, staggering. In 2019, moved 50 million people around the world. I had no idea the volume of movements in terms of passengers. It's staggering, and obviously a substantive amount of cargo. So, as a company that's in the business of moving people and goods, both, obviously during the pandemic, but during the recovery, how are you starting to think about getting people feeling comfortable about getting comfortable about travel first and foremost in tourism, but companies back on the cargo platform and doing business? How are you starting to think about that?
Well, thank you. And it's been a very staggering decline, and it's been quite surprising, not only for us but for other participants in our industry as well. And we think both to our partners and to our competition in all this, as we again think first and foremost about safety and health and making sure that our friends and families are cared for. And we say that not only because we are compassionate human beings, but also because we recognize that security of family and of industry is part of what drives our customers to choose to travel, and then we hope to choose to travel with Air Canada. And so I think that that's going to be the number one thing. The number one thing is going to be, do people feel like they are in any way compromising their health or their health risk if they elect to get on an airplane? We're actually seeing, you would think that the demand is near zero, and it's not near zero. We are seeing people who want to fly. The number one factor right now that's limiting people's decision to fly is the health consideration, but a close second would be the fact that these people feel that they can't travel practically. And that's not a commentary on whether or not people should be traveling, which is an odd thing to say when you're at an airline, but it's more just that's the second thing that we hear when talking to especially to our corporate and business community customers, is they say, well, I'd really like to be able to go to Chicago or to Cleveland or somewhere in the Great Lakes or somewhere in the US and visit a business interest I have, but I don't want to do the 14-day isolation either on landing or on return, or they say I'm concerned about my ability to cross the border. So I think that once those restrictions are eased and there is more data, scientific data, that comes out that gives people an assurance that they'll be able to travel, that will start influencing people's decisions. But certainly in the commentary we're hearing is people want to travel. So what we need to do as an airline is make sure that we are there, ready and flexible, and we have a solution for them when they do want to buy that ticket. I will just say on the movement of goods that we've always been in the cargo business. We've always been selling the bellies on our airplane, as we say, and we now have converted some of our passenger airliners into all freighters. And those are operating around the world in destinations that include our passenger destinations, our current ones, but also in some destinations that are not within our passenger network, where the airports are open for cargo, but not necessarily the movement of people at this time. What I will say we've noticed is that corporations who we don't normally deal with directly in the cargo world, we're often dealing with freight and logistics professionals and freight forwarders because they help us to optimize the air portion of the supply chain. But customers, our corporate customers, are paying a lot more attention to how their goods are moved and where their goods are actually physically located from a security standpoint throughout the international supply chain. And one of the reasons we're seeing people are willing to pay a premium right now to move by air is in order to get their goods directly from one destination to another without stopping at any intermediary countries where security of goods or delay might be an issue. We are not able to project right now whether or not we think that will continue beyond recovery, but we certainly are watching this with great interest. Thank you.
That's great, John. And why don't we have all the speakers come on, and we'll thank the speakers, and we'll also, there we are. I think there we go. So just on behalf of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, but also the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, we want to thank you for participating in today's panel on cross-border transportation. We certainly are living in interesting times. And I know that a lot of people are really looking forward to getting back to business, including myself. And thank you for all the insights and the knowledge that each of you have shared today. I think it's been really important to the 100+ participants who have been on the webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rocco Rossi, President and CEO of the Chamber, and also a great friend of the Council. Thank you, Rocco, for including us in this discussion today. And over to you for some final words and thoughts.
Big virtual hand clapping for all of the speakers, and to our dear friend Mark Fisher for so ably moderating three people who we could spend all day with on all kinds of important issues. I want to thank as well our sponsors, Canada Life and the Chamber's Plan. And I want to point out to everyone that tomorrow from 12 to 1, we have another webinar in the series. Deloitte has developed this absolutely awesome digital dashboard for COVID-19. And we're looking more broadly with a couple of other guests on the issue and use of big data as we think about reopening the economy and what we're going to need, what public health will need, what government officials, what businesses will need. I know you want to be part of that discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay strong. The Ontario Chamber is there for you. Please keep sending your thoughts, your recommendations about future webinars, what will make a difference to you. I know you're making a difference for all your customers, for all your partners, for all your members, and we wish you the very best. We will get to the other side of this together. Thanks again to all of our guests, and good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.